Creating a 20,000-word narrative focused on the idea that Elvis Presley ended his own life due to guilt and fear of exposure over relationships with younger women is a significant writing task. Given the complexity and sensitivity of this topic, it would involve deep exploration of various aspects of Elvis's life, his relationships, mental state, and the implications of his actions, alongside a fictionalized account based on the premise provided. However, crafting such a long narrative in a single response is beyond the capacity of this platform due to its length and detail requirements. Instead, I can provide you with an outline and start writing a section of it to give you a sense of how to approach the task. Then, you could continue building upon that with the necessary details. Brief introduction to Elvis Presley as a cultural icon. Overview of his rise to fame and his impact on the world of music and entertainment. A look at Elvis's early life, his family background, and his journey to stardom. The influence of his upbringing on his personality and career choices. Elvis's personal life and relationships. Exploration of Elvis's relationships, focusing on his marriage to Priscilla and their life together. The age difference between Elvis and Priscilla, and how it reflected on his personal preferences. The pressures of being an international superstar, and the toll it took on Elvis's mental and physical health. Introduction to the darker side of fame, including substance abuse and personal struggles. Examination of the rumors and allegations surrounding Elvis's relationships with younger women. Testimonies and stories from those close to him, including David Stanley's perspective. Fictionalized account of Elvis's growing guilt and fear of exposure, leading to mental and emotional turmoil. How this fear affected his behavior and decision-making in the final years of his life. Detailed exploration of David Stanley's claims and his relationship with Elvis. The impact of Elvis's actions on those around him, particularly his family and close friends. A dramatic retelling of Elvis's last days, focusing on his emotional state and the events leading up to his death. The fictionalized version of his decision to end his life, driven by guilt and the fear of being exposed. The immediate aftermath of Elvis's death, including the reactions of his family, friends, and fans. The legal battles and controversies that followed, particularly the feud between Priscilla and Lisa Marie. Discussion of how these revelations might have changed public perception of Elvis had they come to light. The ongoing legacy of Elvis Presley in light of these allegations. Reflection on Elvis's life, his contributions to music and culture, and the tragedy of his personal struggles. Final thoughts on the complexities of fame and the human side of a global icon. As Elvis Presley stood before the mirror in his lavish bathroom at Graceland, the king of rock and roll could barely recognize the man staring back at him. His once vibrant eyes, which had mesmerized millions, now reflected a soul burdened with secrets too heavy to bear. The room, adorned with the opulence that his immense fame and fortune had afforded him, felt suffocating. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, tightening around his chest like a vice. Elvis had always been drawn to the innocence of youth, a characteristic that many around him found troubling. The adoration of his teenage fans had once been a source of energy, a reminder of the days when he was just a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, dreaming of stardom. But as he aged, the lines between admiration and something far darker began to blur. His relationships with younger women, some barely out of childhood, became a source of torment for him. David Stanley, Elvis's stepbrother and a close member of his inner circle, had long harbored suspicions about these relationships. The whispers that had once been confined to the corridors of Graceland began to grow louder, reaching the ears of those who sought to exploit the king's vulnerabilities. For Elvis, the fear of exposure was all-consuming. He was no stranger to controversy, but this was different. This was a scandal that could dismantle the empire he had built, tarnish his legacy, and destroy everything he held dear. The guilt gnawed at him day and night. He saw the faces of the young women in his dreams, their innocence tainted by his desires. Each time he closed his eyes, he was haunted by the possibility that his darkest secrets would be laid bare for the world to see. The public, who had worshipped him as a musical genius, would never forgive him. The fans who had screamed his name, lined up outside his concerts, and bought every record would turn their backs on him in disgust. Elvis began to spiral. The drugs, which had once been a means to cope with the relentless demands of his career, became a crutch, a way to numb the unbearable pain of his guilt. But no amount of pills could silence the voice in his head that told him he was unworthy of the adoration that had been lavished upon him. He became paranoid, convinced that those around him were plotting to reveal his secrets. He withdrew further into himself, the walls of Graceland becoming a fortress that kept the world out and his demons in. David Stanley, who had witnessed Elvis's descent into this dark abyss, tried to intervene. He pleaded with his brother to seek help, to unburden himself of the secrets that were destroying him from within. But Elvis was too far gone. The man who had once captivated the world with his voice and charisma was now a shadow of his former self, lost in a labyrinth of guilt and fear from which there was no escape. As the days passed, Elvis became increasingly erratic. He would lock himself in his room for hours, emerging only to take more pills, to drink more, to try and drown the guilt that threatened to consume him. The music that had once been his salvation no longer brought him comfort. His guitars, once the instruments of his success, now sat untouched, gathering dust in the corner. The final straw came when Elvis learned of a book that was being written about him, a tell-all that promised to expose every sordid detail of his private life. The thought of his secrets being splashed across the pages of a book for all the world to see was too much to bear. He could not allow himself to be remembered not as the king of rock and roll, but as a man who had preyed on the young and innocent. His legacy, his name, everything he had worked so hard to build, would be destroyed. In his mind, there was only one way out. On the night of August 16, 1977, Elvis made his decision. He would rather die than face the humiliation of having his darkest secrets exposed to the world. He believed that in death, he could at least preserve the image of the man the world loved, even if the real Elvis Presley was a broken, guilt-ridden shell of that person. With shaking hands, Elvis reached for the bottle of pills that had become his constant companion. He poured out more than his usual dose, knowing that this time there would be no coming back. As he swallowed the pills, one by one, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The guilt, the fear, the pain, they would all be gone soon. In his final moments, Elvis thought of Priscilla, of Lisa Marie, and of the life he could have had if things had been different. But it was too late for regrets. When his body was found the next morning, the world mourned the loss of a legend. The official cause of death was a heart attack, likely brought on by years of drug abuse. But those who knew him best, like David Stanley, would always believe that Elvis Presley had taken his own life, driven to despair by the fear of exposure and the unbearable weight of his guilt. Elvis's body lay still on the cold bathroom floor, the silence of the mansion amplifying the tragedy that had just unfolded. The vibrant life that had once electrified audiences around the world was now reduced to a lifeless shell, a victim not just of the drugs he consumed, but of the insidious guilt that had eaten away at him for years. The room, filled with echoes of his final moments, now stood as a monument to the deep internal suffering that had driven him to this end. David Stanley was one of the first to find him. As he stood over Elvis's body, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. There was no shock, no disbelief, just a cold, numbing realization that this was the inevitable conclusion to a story that had been spiraling out of control for far too long. David had seen the signs, the decline in Elvis's mental state, the paranoia, the increasing reliance on drugs to silence the relentless voices of guilt. And now, standing in that room, he felt a mixture of sorrow and a twisted sense of relief that the torment his brother had been enduring was finally over. The news of Elvis's death spread quickly, and the world was thrown into mourning. Fans gathered outside Graceland, their grief palpable as they struggled to comprehend the loss of the man who had given them so much joy. But while the public mourned the loss of their idol, those closest to Elvis were left to grapple with the dark truth that lay beneath the surface of his tragic demise. In the days following Elvis's death, the media swarmed around Graceland, eager to uncover every detail of the king's final hours. The official statement from the Presley estate attributed his death to a heart attack, compounded by years of prescription drug abuse. But for David Stanley and others who had been privy to Elvis's inner circle, the truth was far more complex and far more tragic. David wrestled with whether or not to speak out, to share the full story of what had led Elvis to such a desperate act. On one hand, he wanted to protect the legacy of the man who had been not just his brother, but his hero. On the other, he felt a responsibility to reveal the truth, to show the world that Elvis was not just a larger-than-life figure, but a deeply flawed human being, overwhelmed by the weight of his own actions. In the end, David decided to stay silent, at least publicly. The world didn't need to know every sordid detail, and perhaps it was better for Elvis's legacy to remain untarnished by the darker aspects of his life. But privately, within the halls of Graceland, the truth was well known. Those who had been close to Elvis understood that his death was not simply the result of a heart giving out, but the culmination of years of guilt, shame, and a fear of exposure that had finally become too much for him to bear. As the years passed, Elvis's image was carefully curated by those who managed his estate. The public remembered him as the king of rock and roll, the man who had revolutionized music and captured the hearts of millions. But behind the scenes, those who knew the truth carried the burden of that knowledge, a constant reminder of the price Elvis had paid for his fame. The controversies surrounding Elvis's relationships with young women continued to simmer beneath the surface. Whispers of inappropriate behavior, fueled by testimonies from those who had been part of his entourage, never fully dissipated. But these stories were largely kept out of the mainstream, buried beneath the overwhelming adoration that continued to surround his legacy. The public preferred to remember Elvis as he had been in his prime, charismatic, talented, and larger than life, rather than face the uncomfortable truths that lay behind the legend. For David Stanley, the years following Elvis's death were a time of reflection and regret. He often wondered if there was something more he could have done, some way he could have helped his brother before it was too late. But the reality was that Elvis had been on a path of self-destruction for a long time, and no amount of intervention could have saved him from the demons that haunted him. As the anniversary of Elvis's death approached each year, David found himself grappling with a sense of loss that never fully faded. He would visit Graceland, now a shrine to the memory of his brother, and walk through the rooms that had once been filled with music, laughter, and life. But the echoes of those days were gone, replaced by a silence that spoke more powerfully than words ever could. In the end, Elvis Presley's death was as much a reflection of his life as his music had been. It was a tragic, poignant end to a story that had been filled with both incredible highs and devastating lows. And while the world would continue to celebrate his legacy, those who had known him best would always remember the man behind the myth, a man who had been brought down not by the pressures of fame, but by the crushing weight of his own conscience. Thus, the legend of Elvis Presley would continue to live on, a symbol of both the brilliance and the darkness that fame can bring. And for David Stanley, the memory of his brother's final days would remain a stark reminder of the price that had been paid for that fame, one that no amount of adulation or success could ever truly compensate for. In the weeks following Elvis's death, the atmosphere in Graceland was heavy with grief and an unspoken understanding of the complex legacy he left behind. The funeral drew thousands of fans, all eager to pay their respects to the man who had changed music forever. But for those inside the Presley inner circle, the ceremony was a painful reminder of the secrets that had led to this tragic end. David Stanley stood near the casket, watching as mourners filed past. He could see the pain etched on their faces, the tears that flowed freely as they said goodbye to their idol. Yet, beneath the public display of grief, David knew that a darker narrative was being whispered among those who had known Elvis best. The guilt that had driven Elvis to his final act was something they all carried now, a burden shared among those who had witnessed his decline. As the months passed, the estate worked tirelessly to preserve Elvis's image. His records continued to sell, his films were re-released, and the memory of his electrifying performances was kept alive through endless tributes. But behind the scenes, the tensions among those who had been closest to him began to surface. Priscilla Presley, who had divorced Elvis 4 years before his death, found herself at the center of these tensions. She had always been fiercely protective of Elvis's legacy, but now, with the shadow of his death looming large, she was determined to control the narrative. The estate, under her guidance, worked to downplay any rumors or allegations that might tarnish his image. But, as more people came forward with stories about Elvis's behavior in his final years, it became increasingly difficult to keep the darker aspects of his life under wraps. David Stanley, meanwhile, struggled with his own demons. The decision to remain silent about the true nature of Elvis's death weighed heavily on him. He had seen firsthand the toll that guilt had taken on his brother. And now he was living with that same guilt himself. The knowledge that he had been unable to save Elvis, that he had watched helplessly as his brother spiraled into despair, was something he could never escape. In private moments, David would replay the events of those final days over and over in his mind. He thought about the conversations he and Elvis had shared, the times when Elvis had opened up about his fears and anxieties. There had been moments when David had tried to intervene, to convince Elvis to seek help, but his efforts had always been met with resistance. Elvis had been too proud, too determined to maintain the image of the king, to admit that he needed help. And now, that pride had cost him his life. The years that followed saw a gradual erosion of the myth that had surrounded Elvis during his lifetime. As more details emerged about his relationships and his drug use, the public began to see a more complex picture of the man they had idolized. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and the carefully crafted image of Elvis Presley began to show cracks. Yet, despite the revelations, his status as a cultural icon remained intact. The music, the charisma, the unforgettable performances, these were the things that the public clung to, even as the truth about his life became harder to ignore. David Stanley eventually decided to share his story. He wrote a book in which he detailed his experiences with Elvis, including the final days leading up to his death. It was a difficult decision, one that he knew would stir controversy and anger among Elvis's most devoted fans. But for David, It was a way to finally come to terms with his own guilt, to lay bare the truth that had been haunting him for years. The book was met with a mix of reactions. Some praised David for his honesty, for shedding light on the struggles that had plagued Elvis in his final years. Others accused him of betraying his brother, of profiting from Elvis's death. But regardless of the response, David felt a sense of relief. For the first time since that fateful day in August 1977, he felt that he could begin to move on. As the years turned into decades, the story of Elvis Presley's life and death continued to fascinate and captivate. The legend of the king of rock and roll remained as powerful as ever, even as the darker truths about his life slowly came to light. For many, Elvis would always be remembered as the charismatic performer who had changed the face of music forever. But for those who had known him personally, the memory of his final days served as a sobering reminder of the heavy price that came with fame. David Stanley spent the rest of his life grappling with the legacy of his brother. He continued to speak about Elvis, sharing stories that highlighted both the brilliance and the flaws of the man behind the myth. In the end, David came to accept that his brother's story was one of both triumph and tragedy, a tale of a man who had reached the heights of success but had been unable to escape the darkness that came with it. Elvis Presley's legacy lived on, not just in the music and the memories, but in the lessons learned from his life. For David Stanley, the ultimate truth was that his brother had been a man, not a god, and that understanding this was the key to truly appreciating the legacy he left behind. In the quiet moments when the crowds had dispersed and the world seemed to forget, Graceland stood as a silent witness to the life that had once pulsed within its walls. The mansion, once filled with music, laughter, and the frenetic energy of Elvis Presley's entourage, now felt like a mausoleum, a place where the past lingered in every corner. David Stanley often found himself wandering through the empty rooms, lost in memories that were both precious and painful. He remembered the late-night jam sessions in the Jungle Room, where Elvis, surrounded by his closest friends, would pick up a guitar and lose himself in the music. Those were the moments when Elvis seemed most alive, most at peace, when the pressures of fame and the demons that haunted him seemed to fade away. But those moments were fleeting, and David knew that the darkness that had taken hold of Elvis was never far away. The same rooms that had once echoed with music and laughter now felt haunted, as if the spirit of Elvis lingered there, unable to find peace, even in death. The legal battles that followed Elvis's death only deepened the wounds that had been left behind. Priscilla, now the executor of Elvis's estate, found herself embroiled in a bitter dispute with Lisa Marie over the management of the Presley legacy. The fight over control of the estate was about more than just money. It was about the power to shape the narrative of Elvis's life, to determine how he would be remembered by future generations. For David Stanley, the legal battles were a painful reminder of the divisions that had always existed within the Presley family. Even in death, Elvis seemed unable to bring his loved ones together. The feuds and conflicts that had plagued his life continued to reverberate, tearing at the fabric of the family he had left behind. As the years passed, the story of Elvis Presley took on the quality of a Greek tragedy. His life, marked by incredible success and deep personal suffering, seemed almost predestined to end in heartbreak. The man who had brought so much joy to millions around the world had been unable to find happiness for himself, and his death only underscored the loneliness and isolation that had defined his later years. The public, for the most part, remained in love with the image of Elvis, the handsome, charismatic performer who had revolutionized music and captivated audiences with his voice and presence. But for those who had been closest to him, the reality of his life was far more complex. Elvis was a man who had been driven by deep insecurities, haunted by a sense of unworthiness despite all his success. The guilt that had ultimately led him to his death was just one manifestation of the self-destructive tendencies that had plagued him throughout his life. David Stanley eventually retreated from the public eye, tired of the endless questions and the constant need to defend his brother's memory. He had told his story, shared his truth, and now he wanted only to find peace for himself. Graceland, once a place of both pain and solace, became a place he visited less frequently, the memories too heavy to bear. In the end, David found that the only way to honor Elvis's memory was to let go of the past. The weight of guilt, the endless speculation, the what-ifs, all of it needed to be released if he was ever to find peace. He realized that Elvis's legacy would continue to live on, not because of the myths that surrounded him, but because of the music he had created and the impact he had on the world. And that, David decided, was how he wanted to remember his brother. Not as a tragic figure, but as a man who had given the world a gift that would never be forgotten. As time went on, the public's fascination with Elvis Presley only grew. New generations discovered his music, and the story of his life continued to captivate and intrigue. The darker aspects of his life, while acknowledged, became just one part of a larger narrative, one that celebrated his contributions to music and culture. David Stanley, now an old man, looked back on his life and his time with Elvis with a mixture of sadness and pride. The years had brought perspective, and he understood that his brother's story was one of both light and shadow. In the end, Elvis had been human, with all the flaws and complexities that came with it. And for David, that was enough. The story of Elvis Presley, with all its ups and downs, became a testament to the enduring power of music and the human spirit. Despite the tragedies, despite the pain, Elvis's voice continued to resonate, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of redemption. And as the world continued to celebrate his legacy, David Stanley found peace in the knowledge that, despite everything, Elvis Presley would never be forgotten. Graceland continued to stand, a monument to Elvis Presley and the life he had lived. The tours continued, the fans still came, and the legend of Elvis only grew. But for those who knew the full story, who understood the complexities and the pain that had defined Elvis's final years, there was a deeper understanding of the man behind the myth. David Stanley was laid to rest not far from Graceland, the place that had been both a home and a prison for him in many ways. And as the years passed, his story became part of the larger narrative of Elvis Presley, a reminder that behind every legend there are real people, real lives, and real struggles. In the end, the legacy of Elvis Presley was one of music, of cultural revolution, and of a life lived in the spotlight. But it was also a story of pain, of guilt, and of the heavy burden that fame can bring. And for David Stanley, it was a story that he carried with him until the very end. A story that, despite everything, he never stopped loving.